This is Cheryl.
This is Emma.
This is Catherine.
And we're the Baronesses. This episode is coming to you from Yuggera country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and recognise their continuing connection to land, sea, culture and community. We pay respects to elders past and present. Trigger warning. Listener discretion is advised as this podcast may contain sensitive topics relating to pregnancy loss, grief and trauma.
Welcome back, guys. This is episode 5. This is going to be about chronic illness and compounded grief. It's Catherine's episode. So, what's this one going to be about?
So basically, Cheryl, we're going to be looking at chronic illness and how that can be compounded in terms of grief, especially when we're looking at infertility. So basically, when we think about grief, we often think about death and end of life and just endings. And the reality, though, is that grief can occur for any given reason. So it could be any kind of trauma or change. It doesn't necessarily have to be a death. Okay, so it could just be a different outcome in our experience than what we had expected. But often a loss is a loss, regardless of how we experience that. So we might consider, things like child loss or miscarriage, but it's also thinking about things like loss of a dream or a future that we had imagined. And I think we can all agree that we've all experienced that to some extent in our own experiences. But for a person who has a chronic illness, that can be compounded because we're already dealing with the loss of the life that we had imagined before we got diagnosed with that condition. So for people who are diagnosed with a chronic illness, we have to know there's an issue, but we might not have a name to be able to put to it until we've gone through a barrage of testing and a whole bunch of processes before we can get an actual diagnosis. So we sort of have an idea about how our life is being impacted, but we might not know the true extent to how much our life might be impacted in the future. So basically, we're sort of looking at the magnitude of the impacts and how it actually compounds like scaffolding, really, when we have a chronic illness and we combine that with infertility. So having a chronic illness, it can influence our decision as to whether or not we want to go down the path of having children. It can also impact whether or not we can have children, whether that's the disease itself or the complications that might arise from that disease, or it might be the treatments that we need to do in order to be able to treat that disease. So, for example, when I was about 11 years old, I got diagnosed with a neurological condition. And the best medication at the time was a medication that was very, very widely known to cause birth defects. And so at the time, it was just advised that, when you want to have children, you need to think very hard about that. And I guess luckily for me, technology had changed by then, medications had changed by the time I started thinking about having children. But it's still a medication that's very commonly used, but now there's much more research on it and more awareness about how that impacts people, whether it's male or females using that medication and their fertility. And it's very well known that people need to be informed about the possible effects of that medication before they start having children. And that's been a long-term thing. But as I said, luckily, a lot of technology has changed, so that may not be a first line of treatment for a lot of conditions that require that particular medication. But there are a lot of conditions that the treatment is very similar in the way that it impacts whether or not you can have children, or what impacts it might have if you do suddenly find yourself pregnant. So, having a chronic illness, it's very complex. The way that we experience it is very complex, and it might be that, say, two people have the same condition, but you might not have the same illness experience. And, it might be that, say, for example, if I had the same condition as Emma and I had a certain set of symptoms, but Emma had a completely different set of symptoms, she might experience that in a different way than I do. So how I respond to that physically and emotionally might be very different to the way that Emma might deal with that. And it might, make me consider my life choices in a different way than what Emma might do. Yeah? Okay, so basically, we can't assume that people that have chronic illness are going to be infertile, but we can't make any assumptions about anything, really. But it might be that you have a chronic condition and it impacts a lot of different areas of your life, and therefore we need to sort of start to think about whether or not having children is the best decision. Because when you've got things like, chronic pain or extreme fatigue, how might those things impact us if we had to care for children or care for other people, when often there are times when we know that it's a struggle just to care for ourselves. So it's a big issue. It's a real big issue.
And then, so that was a factor that I had to consider. But then I also used to worry my body is so depleted and is so struggling with so much. What is my body going to be able to give everything to a baby in utero that it needs? Or will my child also have health deficits because of my composition?
Yeah,
that was
absolutely.
a genuine concern,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that's a big thing to consider, is not only how would having children impact us, but how would our condition impact our ability to care for that child. And often, because just being pregnant and having babies, it affects our body in so many different ways that when you have something else that could complicate that, then the outcomes could be very different compared to that of a healthy person.
Yes, totally true.
Yeah, so, again, when we've got a chronic illness, often a lot of things feel like they've been taken away from us. So whether it's our, dreams for the future, or our stability in terms of having a job or doing basic things, whether it's, being able to run down to the supermarket and get the groceries,
Just
or
being able to make a plan.
being
Can
able
I
to make
see
a
my
plan.
friend on the weekend? I don't know.
Exactly.
know yet.
It might be that, yes, I want to say yes to that social event, but, by Saturday, am I going to be too tired from doing all the things that I had to do during the week just to get by? That's it. And we have to take into consideration, all the things. So I don't know, have you guys ever heard of spoon theory? Yes. Okay. So we know that, you wake up in the morning with a certain number of spoons, and we need to use one spoon for every activity that we do, no matter how big or small. And when we run out of spoons, and that's it, we can't get more spoons. And that's basically, a day-to-day thing when you're living with a chronic disease. And, how do I get more spoons? How do I get through my day, my week, the next 10 minutes with the remaining spoons that I have? And am I going to have enough to get through the rest of the day, or do I just have to cut my losses and just have a nap right now because there is no other option?
That's it.
And, the thing is, when you have kids, you don't have that choice. You have to be on the go 100% of the time.
Yeah.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
And, for me, I had to really think about how my chronic diseases would impact my ability to be able to parent. And in the end, I had to sort of start to think about the practicalities of how that might actually work. And, for me, I started to think, oh, well, if this happened and I had a small human, how would we navigate that situation? Yeah. Because if I was home alone and something happened, what would I do? Do I have a backup plan? Do I have a neighbour or a friend that I could call at last minute? And for some people, that can be really very tricky. And, if you're not living near your family, if you're not close to your support system, or, you live in a different state, different city, different suburb, that can make that really very complicated. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I can sort of relate. I don't have a chronic illness myself, even though I've got endometriosis. It's silent endometriosis. But the way that I can relate is just through ill mental health, really. I kind of relate to the spoons, like just not having enough energy, and just the feeling of like losing something that you wanted, but you can't have it. I really relate to that. Even though I don't have chronic illness, I do have like a chronic mental health condition. So I was diagnosed with complex PTSD in my early 20s. And that was from, poor childhood experiences. And it really did affect every part of my life. And for a long time, I didn't want kids because I thought that I was going to ruin things for them. I was going to abuse them or hurt them, or even if it wasn't on purpose, And so I kind of really relate to that, even though I don't have a chronic illness. It's very relatable.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you can even see from your own experience, Cheryl, how that might have been, impacting your ability to be a parent or to do the things that you need to do. So with the grief cycle, we can see really clearly about the 5 stages of grief. So have you guys heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross?
Yes.
Yeah. So we've got the 5 stages of grief that she identified back in 1969, by the way. So denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And, we can see that when we look at chronic disease. We can also see that in our fertility experiences as well, and we know that those 5 stages of grief, they're not linear. We can bounce back and forwards between each of the stages of grief, and just when you think you've got it in your head that you've dealt with things really, really well and you've accepted your situation, suddenly you're back into anger and bargaining all over again. And it's very much almost cyclic, but it doesn't follow any particular pattern. You could be good one day and not the next day. And chronic disease also follows a similar pattern, right? You could be good one day and not the next day. So, it's very difficult to be able to manage that on a daily basis. So when we add infertility to that, it's just like another blow. Yeah. And, how do we then deal with that? How do we bounce back from that? How do we deal with the grief on top of the grief? We're sort of already figuring out how to manage our day-to-day, how to manage our jobs, how to manage our relationships, how to manage, our quality of life and our everyday functioning. But then when we add that next level of infertility and hoping that we're going to have, a good outcome, and it doesn't happen, how do we then manage that? And I think the thing about the 5 stages of grief is that Kubler-Ross noted that even though we might bounce back and forth between the stages, the underlying feeling that we get throughout it all is the idea of hope. So how do we experience hope? How have you guys experienced hope?
Oh gosh, I have a complicated relationship with hope. Very, very complicated, because I feel like sometimes it can be toxic in a way, especially if you just keep trying and trying and trying, and it's not working, and you're actually putting yourself through a lot of trauma and heartache because of hope. Yeah.
So when I was very sick, I kind of used to use that. I'm like, well, I'm sick, so I can't have kids right now, but that's okay because when I'm better, I used it as it's hard to explain, but I would see all my friends having their kids, and I'm like, it's okay because I'm just sick right now, but when I'm better, like then I'm gonna do that too. So I used it like that. But then I was also just thinking, hope. Like, wasn't there something about Pandora's box, and hope was the last thing that flew out of it or something? So they talk about opening. Do you really want to open Pandora's box? And then hope is the last thing that flew out. So I'm like, hope is a tricky thing.
It is a tricky thing. And I know for me, with my illness experience, like I was mentioning before, the medication that I was on, came with some pretty devastating birth defects had I been taking that during pregnancy. But with technology, medications changed and side effects improved, and just when you think you're on top of it and go, okay, well, I'm good, I can probably start to consider pregnancy, then bam, you get diagnosed with another disease. And then that medication has its own set of issues, which might do things like cause spontaneous abortions. And suddenly you're back in square one going, okay, now I have to think about how I'm going to deal with this new diagnosis and new round of treatment, and where do I go from there? And then technology turns the tide again and changes and brings that hope back, because the medications change, the treatments change, and suddenly you're thinking, oh, actually, maybe I can do this. And then so you go, okay, well, maybe let's try and have a baby. And then that hope gets kind of blown to pieces when it doesn't go to plan, when you've got all of your ducks lined up in a nice little row, your treatment's going really well, you're healthy for the first time in forever, and you go, oh, let's have a baby. And apparently your ducks weren't quite in a row, and the target moves, and again, you're grieving all over again, just when you thought you had a handle on your grief.
That is so relatable.
Yeah. Right. And then that led me down another little rabbit hole. Okay, so we know it, we've got our 5 stages of grief, but then there's some more research that is built upon the 5 stages of grief, and that led us to 7 stages of grief. So with the 7 stages of grief, then we start looking at other things like how do we rebuild? How do we reconnect? How do we, move through what we call the upward turn, the change of events that, we can see an improvement in the situation, and then the reconstruction and working through that. And I think that's probably where most of us are at the moment, is looking at the reconstruction phase of our grief and looking at how we can rebuild our lives, and what positive things can we get out of that? What hope can we see? What hope can we grasp? And how we can use that to propel ourselves to the next phase of our lives. Yeah. And I think that's really where we can start to reconsider our relationship with hope. And, what can we do? How can we use that in order to give ourselves a more fulfilling life, other than the one that we had imagined. Yeah, because we sort of, had an idea of a trajectory that we thought we were going to take, that didn't go to plan for any of us here. And so where do we go from there? How do we use that hope to then get to where we would like to be in our lives? So I think the stages of grief give us a lot to think about, and give us a bit of a, not necessarily a life cycle, but kind of a roadmap a sketchy roadmap of how we can navigate from one to the other.
Do you know, just want to share, so I'm the kind of girl who used to sit down at the end of every year, at the start of, over that Christmas period, and I'd sit down and I'd do a vision board. So I'd really go through magazines and all of this and pick out words and whatever. And for a long, long time, there was the family pictures were on that vision board. And then the last couple of years, I'm like, well, I'm not going to do it. Like, that hasn't worked out. And so I've shifted, I guess, from having an external point of reference to now having an internal one. Yeah. So rather than focusing out and that's what I want and whatever, I'm internally focused and like, what feels good? Where is this pulling me? And that shift has really helped me to move forward.
It does sound quite helpful, actually. I'm going to give that a go. Yeah, no, I think that's really good.
Yeah, I agree. I think that is a really healthy way to look at, rather than looking for the external validation, looking at, what we can do on the inside in order to give us what we need to nurture ourselves, nurture our own souls, rather than to look at everything in the real world and go, why can't I have that? Yeah,
because we don't have control over those things. We just don't. Like, no one has control over it, really.
And, it's a very common saying, I think my father used to say to me, life is what happens while you're busy making other plans.
Yeah, that's true.
Like that, it happens. That's
Life's
for a
about the
lot of
journey,
people,
not the destination.
So.
Yeah,
all those. Yeah,
absolutely.
all those
And
ones,
as well, like, it's very easy for us to sit there and compare, what we wanted with what other people have. So I guess we could say that comparison really is the thief of joy.
It really is, yeah.
Absolutely. I would 100% agree.
It's something that I really struggle with. Like, I do compare myself a lot to other people.
Yeah.
A lot.
And I think we're all guilty of it. But I think that is really just part of the grief and, part of learning to feel what we feel and looking at how we can reconstruct our path through the grief and try and figure out what's on the other side of grief for us.
I just wonder as well, so we might look to someone and go, oh, if only I had that, then I would be happy. But I wonder how many of them are looking outside as well. If only I had that, then I'd be happy. How many of us are looking
Absolutely.
somewhere else?
I mean, I'm looking at the lotto every week.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. Yeah. I think that for me, it's been quite a hard journey because, in my 20s, I didn't really want to have children because I didn't think that I would be capable of being a good parent. And I was going through a lot of grief at that time just because I was grieving not having the parents that I wanted to have, not having the family stability and structure that I wanted to have. And that was a huge grief for me. And I felt like, I came to a point where I was sort of starting to not fully accept it, but, there were more good days than bad days. And then I kind of feel like I squandered all of that good trajectory by going and trying infertility treatments and it not working out. And now I'm actually back to where I was before I was in that good place.
With a whole lot more baggage.
Yeah. And like I've spoken to my, my psychologist about it, and I've said, it's really hard. Like I feel like I'm just back to where I was, and she's kind of said to me sometimes, but you've got the tools and the ability to work through that a lot better. But I sort of feel like, oh God, do I really? I don't know. And but then I kind of think back to what I was like back then, and I think I do. It's just I just don't see it. I just don't recognize it.
It's hard when you're
is.
in it.
It is.
And I think as you move forward, that will get easier.
Yeah. Yeah, I think and yeah, the infertility and childlessness does bring up a lot of other grief. It's not just the not having children. It can bring everything up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's all connected.
Yeah, and I think, especially when we compound it with chronic disease, I think what we need to know is that it is absolutely okay to feel the feelings, to sit with the shit, and then look at how we can work with that and work through it and clutch on to hope.
Thanks for listening. You can find us on Facebook or Instagram, the Baronesses Podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, we'd love to hear from you. If you have questions or comments or would like to be a guest in our show, drop us an email, baronessespod@gmail.com, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.